Hey listeners, welcome back to the Logos Project. In this episode, Andrew and I talk about the centrality of Christ in spirituality, theology, and social life. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone, to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In today's episode, I am joined once again by Andrew Bartel, former classmate and friend, to talk about all things tradition and all things ecclesiastical politics, but with, at the heart of it, Jesus Christ himself. So, Andrew, how you doing? How's your week been?
It's been great, Dom. Thanks.
Anytime. So, last time we talked about your article in Catholic World Report, which I thought was a brilliant article. And we kind of covered the different facets of the traditionalist movement, specifically the SSPX and its kind of offshoots. And it was focused on your story on trying to find the church that fit the categories that you read in St. Francis de Sales. And I wanted to focus more on the kind of traditionalist culture and critique both the kind of relativist, crazy liberal Catholics on the one side, and then the overly, they determine traditionalists on the other. And I think the best way to do that is to look at the center and look at Jesus Christ himself. And this is, I think, kind of the move that the council was aiming for, was to place Christ back at the center. You kind of had a forgetfulness of him before the council and a kind of forgetfulness of everything else after the council. So to start this, I wanted to talk about the sacraments. So the spiritual life, sacramental piety, and how we encounter the Lord in the Eucharist, in confession, and what's most important in our prayer life.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I think having an episode that really focuses on Christ, I think that's really important. And I think that's one of the major issues in Western Catholicism today, it seems, is that we've really drifted away from the main point of all of this, which is a person. And, you mentioned that it all comes back to Christ. And I don't know if you've taken that class yet on Western civilization. I don't know if you've done that one yet. We have 2 required Western civilization courses. And the first one deals with the Greeks. The Greeks come up and the Stoics feature really largely. And at the center of Stoicism is this regulating principle, this logos. And for them, it was a principle, it was a law. But of course, being the pagans they were and it being before Christ, they didn't realize that this regulating principle was Jesus Christ, that it was a person, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, who would eventually become man. And it's Jesus that all of this is about, all of these little details that we get into about church councils, about the sacraments, all of these things should ultimately be related back to Christ because he's supposed to be that regulating principle. And the further we drift away from remembering that he's what this is all about, we begin to lose our focus and we just get into all of these different rabbit trails. And a lot of these liturgy wars really remind me of that. It's like you get into all of these details, canonical details, liturgical details, history, all these different things. It's like, wait, what are we talking about again? Why is this so important? Why are we talking about liturgy? Like, why are we so wrapped up in it? If you look at like the ratio that say Christ in the Gospels and the worship of God is talked about to a lot of these honestly changeable and transient details when you look at the history of the church, wouldn't that strike you as the same? It doesn't seem to be a bit imbalanced.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, so you brought up what the fathers would call the seeds of the word, and in not just other world religions, but also in the philosophers, in the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics. And it seems to me that you're right. You connected law and Christ, right? Law and logos. How the word that legislates points to the word which is the second person. So that's kind of like the logic of the Old Testament, which is this God legislating so that not only that we may be circumcised on the outside, but eventually so that our hearts themselves may be circumcised through the incarnation, whereby we may receive the Spirit. And I feel that really kind of that brings us to the sacramental life as a Catholic, which is a life which is permeated by the Spirit and made possible. That permeation is made possible by the incarnation. And I I remember thinking of the sacraments mostly as transactional. I say my sins, I get my little haircut in my soul haircut.
Yeah, like a sacramental service station.
Exactly. It's like once a month. Well, my hair's gotten cut along. I got to get a haircut. It's like once a month. These sins have been piling on. Well, I got to get my little, my dose. And so it became more of a kind of contractual quid pro quo as opposed to an encounter with a person. Which, and if you think about it as an encounter with a person, it's not about getting your haircut because it's gotten too long, but it's like, oh, I want to meet this person more often. What, I can go again this week. How about that? Or because I get to encounter a person who is forgiving me, and it's through the tangibility of the sacrament, and so in the life of the Spirit really is connected to that inner dwelling of divine grace, and that shows forth as the gifts of the Spirit in our life. And those fruits and gifts are basically deeply connected to what I can and cannot do. It's not like in the Old Testament where it was merely legal as a shadow of what would happen internally. It's like now morality is intimately tied to the workings of the Spirit in my heart, and that is possible through the encounter with a person, Christ, in the sacraments. So I'm kind of ranting, but you see what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to connect the Spirit with the moral life, and how
Yes.
treating the sacraments as transactions is to kind of miss the point of the encounter, which they're designed to make possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons we can get into this rut of coming along and, getting our fix, if you will, is because an encounter with the spiritual world and spiritual reality of God and God's presence is different than, say, going over to a friend's house, where you go over, he opens the door, then you start having a conversation, you have this back and forth in our human language, our human words, and you have these more tangible feelings that you're left with. Whereas when you go and you commune, you do have those, then that's what the sacraments are. They are these physical realities that bring us into an encounter with the divine. But it's not like we have, most of us have an actual voice in our head where God is saying, go this direction, or do this, or you should work on this, or anything like that. In many ways, it would seem to be silent. But when you think about how God communicates, and even how the angels communicate, is it Thomas Aquinas that talks about this, that the the angels aren't bound by language in the same way we are. They can communicate like thought to thought, just like instantly. And so I think that even though we are bound in our bodies by that kind of communication in general, that doesn't necessarily mean our souls or our spiritual mode of communication isn't capable of receiving that invisible, intangible, grace-filled communication of the divine. And so it's easy for us to forget that, though, and think, well, because I didn't hear these words and I didn't have these conversations, nothing happened. So I'm just going through the motions. And I think that if you bring it to that and realize that the workings of God's grace are invisible even to your consciousness, and that he's still working, he is communicating to you, he is directing you, I think it would help us maybe get a little bit more out of this sacramental service station where we just go through the motions and think, well, did that actually do me any good?
Yeah, and it's like a different level of awareness. Sometimes there might be an actual like dialogue in the etymological sense, like dialogos, like a two-way conversation going on that we may not even be aware of. Because there's like now in modern days we like to talk about the subconscious and psychologizing or psychoanalyzing ourselves. But there's, in a sense, spiritually speaking, it seems to me that the soul can be in dialogue with God, and I think this is what Paul meant by pray at all times. It can be in dialogue with God in a sense where it's living a mode of awareness that is much more profound than the kind of awareness you have, like you said, when you go over to your friend's house and talk with him. And so it's kind of this entirely other dimension of our being, which is one which is like I think St. Thomas talks about spiritual affections, or spiritual states of peace, of joy, things that are not necessarily emotional, although he also talks about the redemption of the emotions where they can mediate between the spiritual affectivity and the kind of emotional affectivity. But it seems to me that I think this is kind of what St. John of the Cross was on about, which is that sometimes, we feel like God's not there until a deeper sense of awareness comes upon us where we realize that he was there all along. And only now do we kind of perceive that. And so I guess the point being is that in a forensic treatment of the sacraments, it's more like there's duties I have. If I fall short, I fix that through the car wash. If I don't fall short, I keep moving forward and I do what's right. But in, I think, the more spiritual and correct understanding of the sacraments, it's more of like I need to develop this dialogue with the Word himself, which takes place in the realism of the sacraments, but it also takes place at all times. And everything I do, morally speaking, is a living out of that dialogue. So it's like the sacrament is like a focused point of that dialogue.
Yeah, it's like that great story of the Curé of Ars, Saint John Vianney, coming into the back of the church and finding that poor man on a regular basis, just sit in the back of the church, and in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And the curé asked him, "Well, what do you say? What do you do?" And the poor man says, "I don't say anything. I look at Jesus and he looks at me." And I think that really captures kind of what we're trying to say, is that once you connect with Christ, with God on that spiritual level, eventually you are able to reach to that practice of the presence of God, that level of contemplation where, like you said, it is a two-way street. It is a communication. It's a surging of love towards love itself, and it's a return. It's like an action reaction. Maximilian Kolbe liked to use the scientific term of action reaction. And I think that it's a great analogy.
No, I agree with you. And I think this is actually perfect because we're talking about dialogue, encountering the Word, encountering Christ. Well, this kind of leads us to sacred scripture. So I just wanted to say, I've encountered a lack of catechesis in certain average areas, in like average Catholic parishes, which is quite frankly really disheartening. And so, because of that, I'm really grateful for my background in traditionalism and traditionalist movements, including the SSPX and the Fraternity of St. Peter, because I got a really rigorous training in catechesis. So, but I I lived something that shocked me, which is that I knew my Baltimore catechism. I knew actually in high school we were taught a lot of like neo-scholastic theology, a lot of St. Thomas through his interpreters, which is great, wonderful, and good. But there was a moment in my life where I realized, this is kind of a long story, but I encountered the scriptures in a new way. And I realized, oh my goodness, I didn't realize this whole time that this was supposed to be about this one person called Jesus Christ. He was a memorized formula alongside all of the neo-scholastic jargon that I was being taught in high school, and he wasn't a real person to encounter. And the thing about scripture is that the only scripture I was exposed to was, the whispered Latin of the epistle and gospel at the altar that I got to hear if I was an altar server. And I'm generalizing, to be fair. Sometimes, depending on where you go to mass, the priest would then recite it in the vernacular at the pulpit before the sermon. So I'm over exaggerating. But then we had a Bible class in high school, and I'm like, oh, so we're going to read the Bible. It was a textbook about the Bible. that was covering the history of the Bible. And it wasn't until I joined a monastery of the Congregation of Salem and I was basically forced to study specifically the Psalms, and I was reading this commentary on the Psalms, which got into the mindset of the Hebrews and trying to understand how they were thinking, what the Psalms were saying. I started to see the Christological meaning of the Psalms, and I was encountering this very real personality of the Jewish people in a way that just enthralled me. And it was also so human, and it was like I was encountering the scriptures for the very first time, and it fascinated me, and it was so beautiful. It was raw, like it was, human lament, like especially some of these psalms when they're in the Babylonian captivity. And it's like some dark stuff, but there's these feelings of hope, love, despair, anguish, but it's all centered on this devotion to the covenant God. And I had never encountered that before, and I think it's through that I came to realize that it was really all about Jesus Christ. And despite this wonderful education I had, practically speaking, I had no idea that it was about Jesus Christ. I had no idea.
Yes. Yes. So, this is really fascinating, Dom, because I remember when I was in school over in France with the Dominicans, we were studying the history of salvation, you might say, and I remember one of my professors pointing out that the existence of the Jewish people to this day is actually a confirmation of Christianity, if you will. So basically their presence and their continued, I mean, in a sense, their rejection, they rejected Christ as the Messiah, and they continued what they'd always been doing, but their presence as a covenant people and what they're yearning for and what they're preserving can show us concretely what it was like before the coming of the Messiah and why the Messiah was necessary. It's like a living representation of what you'd read in a textbook, if that makes sense. And I wonder if the same thing doesn't go for some of these heresies or heretical movements that continue even after councils, for example. Think of like the old Catholics or some, like the Orthodox, or in the instance that we're talking about, the traditionalist movement. It's like a living representation of what it was like as a Catholic to live as a Catholic before the council. And so you can see actually before you what was missing and what the council was actually trying to address. Because I had the exact same experience as you. I memorized the Baltimore Catechism. We attended the sacraments regularly. We studied our faith. We did all of these different things. But it wasn't until I came back into full communion with the church and started encountering so much of this Christological, Christ-centered teaching of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and the documents of the Second Vatican Council that centered and re-emphasized the relationship that we're all supposed to have with Christ. That all of this is about relationship. None of it means anything. It's like giving flowers to your wife, taking out the trash for her, all these different things that you do. If there isn't a love and connection, none of those things mean anything. You could recite poetry to her, forever. And if there isn't love, if there isn't relationship, she's just going to be annoyed, right? And this really is Pauline theology that's cut to the spirit of things. The letter and of the law and the practice is important, yes, but only if it is filled with this life-giving spirit that is love, that is the love of Christ.
Yeah. No, and absolutely, and it was really revolutionary for me because, the sacraments, the liturgy, the knowledge of my faith. In fact, I remember first discovering a little bit of philosophy when I was very young. I must have been, 13 years old, and philosophy, not theology, right, really stirred me. I was like, "Oh, I want to know more about the universe. I want to know more about God as the first cause of all things, about what is infinity. I had all these questions as a kid, and because what it did is that philosophy elicited wonder. And especially when you think about philosophy, and you also so I went to a school where we went camping a lot, and we'd go hiking in the mountains and see this beautiful scenery, the sunsets and the clouds. Sometimes we'd be above the clouds and stuff like that. It was gorgeous and beautiful, and that elicited a lot of wonder. But it also elicits questions such as, who made all this? Is it a who? Is it a person? Like how does that make sense? Like, so what is existence? What is being? And so I was just moved by this sense of wonder. But when it came to theology, I wanted nothing to do with that, because theology was boring, dry. It had nothing to speak besides safeguarding the tradition, safeguarding the faith. You can't be a modernist. Okay, now I'm gonna go do philosophy. That's what it was. Theology just, it had no interest for me until I discovered sacred scripture at the monastery. And what happened was, I discovered, like I said this already, but I think it's important. I discovered the personality of ancient Israel. They have a very distinct Hebraic, Semitic, like, way of expressing themselves. Their poetry is very interesting. Their idioms, the analogies they use, the way they perceive their nation, their kind of sense of social cohesion. There's a very distinct um, yeah, personality is honestly the best word I can think of. And what's interesting about that is, if you understand better the personality of the Jewish people in the ancient Near East, guess what? Jesus was a member of that community. And what shaped his education, what he was raised in, what Our Lady taught him. Our Lady must have, like, read the scriptures with him. It was this Semitic and Hebraic historical humanity, right? God became man. That must mean something. And so it's because that means something that I started to encounter a person, Jesus Christ. And not only was this personality of this Hebrew people very fascinating historically, but, like, it was beautiful. Like, they had this sense of wonder, but also of suffering and redemption and love and anger and despair. Like, it was raw, And I was like, wow, I didn't know this was in scripture. And so, I guess the point was,
Yes.
I moved from this, like, neo-scholastic deductive reasoning in high school to encountering Jesus Christ in the scriptures historically. Now, I don't want to get into all the theological debates. There are some here that are taking place. But what happened is, now I went back to theology with scripture back as the soul of theology, as the source, the kind of source from which I went back to, right? Right? Going back to the source. And now when I read St. Thomas or the commentators on Thomas, now it's fruitful and I love it. You see what I'm saying?
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. Here. I think I could capture it like this.
Okay.
Salvation history is a storybook, not a textbook.
Yes.
If you try to make salvation history a textbook and boil it into a textbook, I mean, who likes textbooks? Except, I don't know, I guess maybe weird people like you and me. Maybe we like, those of us who like to really geek out and get into the textbooks, right? I mean, there is a place for abstracting concepts, and on a lot of these different things and analyzing them. But analysis can only take you so far. Analysis is great for singling something out, but then you have to have synthesis. Then you have to put it back together. And if you were just living in that textbook world, that world of analysis, you're living in a laboratory. It's not the real world, watching this lizard walk along and eat a bug, right? You've got it dissected under the microscope. And both ways are ways of encountering that lizard. But the more full encounter would be encountering the creature alive. You're chasing it around the woods, and that's your story. Your journey is basically the discovery that religion isn't a textbook; it's an adventure. Just like philosophy is supposed to be an adventure. It's wonder, it's emotion, it's feeling, it's experiences. I was just having a conversation earlier this morning with my wife because we watched a really great BBC drama last night, and we were talking about it over breakfast this morning. And I was just telling her, I love literature so much more than I do talking about abstract churchy stuff. And she just looked at me so funny because, of course, I do. I really get into the abstract churchy stuff, but never does my heart come alive and start burning as when you're wrestling with the messiness that is life, with real human stories, human encounters with each other, human encounters with passion and the truth and with God through an actual occurrence. I mean, that's why the Bible is a story. Yeah, there's philosophy, there's teaching, there's poetry, there's all those different things in the Scripture. But most of Scripture is an adventure story. It's a recounting of God's action and His relationship with people.
Absolutely. And so I think I've told you this probably several times already, but I'm a huge Joseph Ratzinger fan. And it's, to me, when I read Joseph Ratzinger's theology, what I see, and this was one of the titles of his encyclicals, Caritas in Veritate, right? Love in truth. His theologizing, right, is deeply beautiful, logical, consistent. It's rigorously intellectual, but it's also deeply prayerful, and it's deeply inward directed and also upward. And there's something about his theology that is very, very conducive to prayer. But also, when I started encountering Christ in the scriptures, I remember reading St. Thomas, not commentators on St. Thomas. And a criticism is made often that Thomas is more dry and like analytic, while Augustine is much more dialogical. And I think that's true. But I think this is where it shows that the stereotypes fall apart. When I started rereading St. Thomas, like straight out of his works, I felt that same sense of wonder that I had felt when I was thinking about philosophy. And so I think what happens is that, both the truth, the logical, you might even say the analytical, and the kind of experiential, subjective, and interpersonal, right? They're not incompatible. In fact, they build this beautiful harmony, which would be basically
Yes.
love in truth, which is what Joseph Ratzinger's encyclical is. The problem, I think, comes when
Yeah. Or intellect and will. Yes.
no, exactly right. This is thoroughly Thomistic, and I think the problem is when you focus on that kind of analytic and deductive, but it becomes more and more and more removed from the life of the faithful. And this was the critique of many of the reformers that were fathers of the council, which is, this stuff is good, right? But what does it have to do with the life of the faithful? Because in fact, and I've said this last time, but in 1958, Ratzinger, right, was saying there's a new paganism in the church. People are living this forensic and legalistic, transactional car wash, haircut, sacramental life, but on the ground, theology has nothing to do with them, nothing to do with their spiritual lives. And so there was these just dichotomies, these separations between morality and spirituality, theology and sacramental experience, and things were being misperceived. And when you bring Christ back in the center, like the Stoics, right, the regulating principle, then all of these constellations reconfigure themselves properly and kind of they're corrected, they're reformed, right? And so I think really the post-conciliar chaos is just the I mean, there's many factors, maybe like too much optimism on the inner life of the church that the fathers had, but ultimately it's the lack of faith that was there before the council kind of exploded after the council, when the configuration, the reconfiguration was being attempted to be made, right, the reform. So that's a long way to say, I've been talking too much, but that's a long way to say that I think that for me, it's discovering the centrality of Christ, especially in the scriptures, scripture being the soul of theology, that really has made me discover theology in general in a very different and beautiful way. And now I absolutely love it way more than philosophy. Anyway, sorry, that was kind of a rant, but
No, that's great.
yeah, we talked about theology as being more sapiential. and something that leads to prayer, not just a deductive, rational science. Because of this kind of off kilt dichotomy, where the kind of deductive and rational science, theology would be a rational deductive science, which was kind of divorced from the sapiential side. What happens is that Christ kind of gets moved outside of the center, but there still is that kind of personal longing in the heart of the human person, right? And that kind of needs to be filled. And my experience was that in the traditionalist culture, that longing was filled by the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, I don't know how I don't know how your experience has been with this, but what happened was my personal relationship dimension, if you might say, was basically Mary and me. Jesus was the memorized formula. He was what the priest was saying up at the altar, which I knew very well. I knew like all the prayers, but it was just memorized prayers. I didn't really understand the theology of the sacrifice of Abel and Melchizedek and the new covenant. But my personal dimension, the interpersonal dimension, was really all about Mary. And so I think you see this where people are praying their devotions to Mary in the pews, and the priest is reciting the Latin formulations at the altar. It's hard for me to like pinpoint specific like moments or actions or prayers I said. I mean, I prayed to Christ, but the way I would describe it was the kind of the charism or the atmosphere of my spiritual life was Marian, in the sense of when it comes to the interpersonal relationship with the religious, you might say, it was always Mary as the go-to, as the one who listens to my prayers. But Jesus was, I knew he was important in name, you might say. He was a memorized formula. Jesus is God. But I didn't realize very realistically the radical centrality of Christ, like on a very existential level. Like Christ was just alongside Mary and the saints, and I knew like intellectually that there was a difference, but experientially, right? There I didn't realize that I was meant to be in a radical relationship with the God man. To me, when it comes to petitions, it was I go to my mother, and that's all great and good. And I guess I'm kind of trying to lead to the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on this, which is that there was a tendency to separate Mary from the church prior to the council. And the council showed how Mary and the church are two different mysteries in the faith that illuminate each other. In fact, she's the archetypal personification of the church. And it's in within the kind of womb or mantle of Mary that we're able to more perfectly turn towards the source, which is Jesus Christ. And what I'm saying is that experientially, that's not how it was working for me.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think it flowed from our emphasis on Christ as King, Christ as Lord, because it's a reaction against the Jesus is my buddy kind of a culture, the hippie culture, because that's what traditionalism is reacting against. It's like, no, you've got to have respect and reverence and honor for Christ. And so, as is often the case, you overcorrect. And so you can lose a little bit of that friendship dimension. And that's one of the reasons I've loved watching the Chosen so much is it really emphasizes the friendship, how human Christ was. He was so human. He was the kind of a guy you know you could have a beer with, or back then a cup of wine, right? He was a great person to be with, just as a human. He was just an excellent human being who surrounded himself with friends, who had friends, and he's a different kind of king. He's not this steward, this distant steward way out there that has almost nothing to do with his people. He's more like the he's more like the Aragorn king, right?
Yeah, that's how it felt for me. Yeah.
Yeah, he's more like the Aragorn king, who's like he's this ranger and he's rubbing shoulders with everybody, and he's in our midst. He's a friend. He's not this distant king, and it's not like I don't think it's
But
not.
his kingship is glorious.
Yeah, and it's not like I think traditionalists that we did this intentionally. I think it's just happened naturally as a part of this reactionary culture that was formed. get away from everything over there because that's bad. Just a wholesale rejection of anything following the Second Vatican Council. I mean, that's so simplistic. It's like, yeah, everything. There's like 1962 hits, and it's like theology basically dies in the church. Or any growth or rediscovery or renewal or these things, like, oh, frozen, and then now it's just preservation, restoration. Like, that's the focus.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've seen this in SSPX bookstores. Not to bag on them too much, but it's like the bookstores are frozen in time. You can only find certain authors, certain doctors of the church from the past. No contemporary theology, wrestling with the contemporary issues. Like, what about this? What's happening here? These questions about the modern world. Um, but that actually is a perfect segue. We're talking about the social kingship of Christ, as well as the fact that he is incarnational, which means that he rubs shoulders with us, as you said. And so this leads to the kind of secular versus religious, the political realm, and how we understand the right and the left, and the liberal and the conservative Catholic. And do you have a lot to say about that? I could talk for days about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and begin, and I'll follow.
Okay, I'll try to make it brief. I've been ranting a lot, but
Well, this is your podcast. This is your ranting place.
indeed, fair enough, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was I entered the study of theology as a kind of right wing Republican conservative, um, and discovered Catholic social teaching and realized that my conception of private property was a liberal one, classically liberal, right? It was mostly from John Locke. The idea that you can do whatever you want with what you own because it's private property, so you can destroy it if you want. So any sense of like the universal destination of all earthly goods was just absent from my thinking. And also just the fact that the right and the left are basically reactions to each other, almost essentially. I still like, so I guess a better phrase to describe where I stand is I'm a conservative, but at the same time, it's like there's some important political causes that, if the ideological ideas are removed from them, should be incorporated by conservatives, such as anti-racism, social justice, care for the poor, right? Emphasis on the poor,
Yep.
um,
The environment.
the environment. That's right. Which is a gift from God, and we're the stewards of it. All this, like, stuff that's been, considered left wing stuff, and it doesn't help that the left has these other kind of attached ideologies to what they're doing. But on the right, it's defined by this reaction to the left. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the more I study the church's teaching through history, the more I stepped out of the kind of back and forth of these factions identified as opposites to each other, and started to realize that, I was letting secular politics decide for me how I felt about what the church taught. And that's my big realization, and my big problem with many Catholics and friends. But of course, as someone else said, you can't expect people to just read a bunch of theology books. Like, people just naturally fall into these binaries. So what do you think of all that, this divide?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the people that I discovered as I was coming out of the traditionalist movement, and this is something that people don't maybe realize, but I know you're very familiar with it, I'm sure, is that when you come out of the traditionalist movement, it's not like one day you just wake up and say, I'm not a traditionalist anymore. It's a really, really gradual process. After I came back into full communion with the church, I was definitely still a traditionalist. I accepted the Second Vatican Council, the validity of the new Mass, and we talked about this in our the last episode that we did. Um,
Hmm.
I held the liturgy at arm's length. I held a lot of things like care for the environment, all of these different things that the traditionalist is just really suspicious of and has issues with. Right, that was definitely me. And this is what's amazing about coming into the church, is that the life of the living spirit, being a part of a living church, a living, breathing church, it begins to shape you if you allow it to. It begins to form you. And these shackles of ideology, because we're so, as humans, we're so prone to being ideological and wanting this neat and tidy ideological package. We go and we stand in our box and we don't go out of it. um, but as I was in the church, I was beginning to have my mind opened to different perspectives and different realities than I had been otherwise used to. And it really has grown me as a person. Like you said, it's not, Peter Kraft talks about this all the time. The church is both traditionalist and progressive. The wise steward draws things from his treasury that are both old and new. That scripture is the death nail of those who are just who say I'm progressive or I'm traditionalist, because that's impossible. You can't just say I always progress. Let's get rid of everything that went before, or progress is always under suspicion. What's new is pretty much always bad, so let's reject it and only stick with what is old, because what is old is always good, right? I mean, that's not the way of God. It's so much more dynamic than that. And so for me, my political views began to shift as well, and I was introduced to Russell Kirk, who you're probably familiar with. He's like a kind of a founding father of the conservative movement here in the United States. And he goes after ideology all the time. He points out how this liberalism, whether it's that of the progressives on the left, or kind of its right wing equivalent, which is libertarianism, that both of these are ideologies. And the difference, and unfortunately, I think many people who call themselves conservatives politically are actually ideologues. Like a lot of talk show hosts, they call themselves conservatives, but actually they're more ideologues. Because when you look at the conservatism of Kirk, it's so much more open. It's like it's a respect for the past, but at the same time, the reason you respect the past is so that you can move into the future, so that you can progress as well. It's this balance between these two worlds. And so it's funny because this political shift would be happening at the same time as my theology shift, my shift of having something that was more encompassing. It's not just black and white. There is black and white, of course. You have to have black and white, but there's also a lot of gray. And how you distinguish black and white and the different circumstances that they arise from, it makes a big difference. And that's the beauty, and that's the beauty of Catholicism, is it's not ideology. Catholicism is not ideology, and when you do, you often end up losing true Catholicism, and you end up with a lot of these factions that we're seeing, especially in the Western Church today.
So it seems to me that you have like extremes where it's like the pre 1962 church is the way to go, and what happened after that, we criticize it. And then you have the other faction, which is like, the spirit of Vatican II, the church has finally updated what was before we criticize. And then you have someone who's like, well, both are in continuity. And I would agree with this, but with a caveat, right? Which is both are in continuity. Therefore, I got to make everything fit. But I think a better position is that, well, you can criticize things from the past and the present, right? God doesn't promise a church that is basically impeccable in all its members and every word spoken by the magisterium. It promises a general guidance of the spirits through the turmoil of history. And so the point being here is that if you're like politically, on one side or the other, and you strongly identify yourself as I am, I'm a left wing liberal, or I'm a right wing conservative Republican or something. If that's how you define yourself, I would reconsider. First of all, you start with I'm a son of God. I'm a Catholic. I believe in this Catholic social teaching. How can I approach these cultural wars in light of faith, not vice versa? And then there's a spectrum. The church is very like, it has these, like Chesterton said, the walls on the playground that you can't cross, but you have a lot of room to play around on the inside, And so I find that I have a lot of disagreements with friends when it comes to kind of political policy or just certain principles here and there. But overall, like we both share the same faith, and it doesn't have to divide us, right? But the thing is, the moment you start with politics, you're inevitably going to be divided. And I think that's a big play in the kind of traditionalism and the liberalism and relativism on the other side.
Yeah, and let's get into some hot water here and just bring up something as an example. Let's talk about the vaccines issue. This whole with the COVID-19 vaccines. I think it's important because again, this is something that right now is at the forefront of a lot of the political debates and our politically charged atmosphere. And a lot of what you would call conservative, right wing Catholics are just beside themselves with the fact that Pope Francis and many good clergy, most of the clergy actually have not opposed the shot. That they don't say it's morally wrong. As a matter of fact, they've said it's okay. And I think a lot of those who, like you said, identify themselves being conservative, and this is the kind of stuff we listen to, which is usually negative, like all the negative things and terrible things you're hearing about the vaccines, and that can be really distressing. And for me, I've been struggling with this as well. I'm not vaccinated, and I don't intend to get vaccinated, just because I'm young. I don't. I've had COVID now twice and survived both times, and I am doing all right. So it's not necessary for me to do, and that was a decision that I made, and that anyone should be allowed to make. The whole vaccine mandate, of course, that's another subject, and that's absolutely ridiculous. But I don't think, because I have an acquaintance who has just ripped on our bishop, and there's probably been many of them who have, because of his approval of the vaccines for those who need it, and even recommendation to get them. And they come from this perspective that no, this is tainted with abortion type thing, and it's going to totally change your genomes and your genetic. It's like genetic modification, and so it's actually like self mutilation, and just all of these different things. But there is another side, and I think this is one of the issues: is that we have so demonized the left, and we're so distrustful of institutions in general, that we think they're out to get us, right? And we think, oh, this is the mark of the beast. This is what's going to destroy humanity and like turn us into who knows what kind of zombies. But the thing about this is, though, is that people have actually been saying this about vaccines for a long time, ever since back in like the 1970s when they started using abortions. So if you're going to say that the church is wrong for allowing it and allowing the moral permissibility of this vaccine when she has already been doing it for a while, you're going to have to say, well, she was wrong back then too. It's just gray, and I think this is what we're getting into, is that there are black and white principles. There is truth and there is falsehood, but as you and I both know, when you study moral theology, the application of those black and white principles is super, super gray. You can't just say, this is the truth, this is how it is. It's way more complicated than that.
Not to mention, there's the distinction between formal participation in evil and material participation in evil. I mean, the case of the vaccine, honestly, is not a very complicated one when it comes to moral theology. I mean, we're not going to talk about that probably in this episode, but I mean, I was surprised that people were upset about it. I'm like, I thought this was like, we've done this for other things before. There is a distinction between formal cooperation and material cooperation, and not just when it comes to vaccines, but when it comes to investing, when it comes to investing's more complicated, but when it comes to so many things like healthcare, working anywhere, really, buying soda, like you name it. Like, I was confused and surprised at the outrage, but that I'll leave that alone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I guess the point of bringing the vaccines up is that so often we can just get into this mindset of vaccines bad, and you don't even look at the other side. You don't look at the good Catholic doctors, that are saying, no, actually, a lot of this hype about the vaccines are not entirely accurate. It's not going to genetically modify you. It's not going to actually change, your genetic structure. The mRNA goes to the DNA, the spike protein is produced, but it doesn't mutate anything, And these are good Catholic doctors that are pointing this out. So there's different sides, there's different opinions, and it's not like this one size fits all. This is the way it is. There's only this perspective,
But see, it sounds like you know more than me, because honestly, like, I don't know anything about this, and I kind of don't care. But it seems to me that one argument that's made is like, well, the time to test a vaccine is much longer. But to add to that, I mean, I know to this day traditionalist friends who are anti-vaccine, like, period, in general, anything. Like, you name the type of vaccine, it's from the devil, you know? So I don't know enough about it, but I just don't care. But yeah, I'm not vaccinated. I'm young, so I don't know.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I just don't think for those of us who are young and healthy, one size fits healthcare is just ridiculous. It's just absolutely ridiculous on face value. So, I'm definitely not saying, there should be these mandates. Everybody should be able
Right.
to choose. But I don't think, I've come to the point where I don't think that this vaccine is the mark of the beast.
No, and I feel like that's a reasonable thing to say. Oh man, so let's see if we can tie this back into Christ. At the end of the day, it seems to me that we've also forgotten about the social kingship of Christ, and how he must be the king of our hearts, and therefore rule the city of our soul. Right? Kind of thinking of Plato right now. The idea of the polis being the kind of macrocosm of the microcosm of the human soul, and the chariots within with the wild horse and everything. But it seems to me that Christ is also the king of the social order. And what that means, and I know, and I don't like using this word because it comes with baggage, but at the end of the day, it's the most appropriate word, and that is social justice, right? Social justice. Just look at the word, drop all the baggage. What does the word mean? It means that Christ is king, and that he wants a just kingdom, and that it's social because we're in communion with each other. And so it seems to me that we need to stop letting the secular culture dictate how we think about things. And it's what happened after the council. It's this idea that instead of the church changing the world just rushed in to the church and messed things up. If we go back to Christ as the source, and then after having drank from that fountain, go out, like at the end of Mass, right? Ite missa est, go forth and preach the good news. After having been refreshed at the banquets, which is Christ, then we go out. And I think this is what you and me are attempting to do here right now, to talk these things through, and to give a different perspective to some people who are kind of stuck in binaries, right? Ideological binaries. The church is not ideological. The church is the freedom of truth, right? It's truth in love, as Pope Benedict would put it. So that's why it's important to have Christ at the center.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I think the point of this conversation was to remind anyone on any side of any aisle, as I like to say, that make sure that Christ is at the center, and then worry about the rest. Worry about the aisles and the peoples and all that stuff. So let's see. I'll close out this conversation, and then we'll see you guys next week. So without further ado, support us on www.patreon.com/The Logos Project. If you support us, we have some exclusive episodes just for patrons. And that being said, we'll see you guys next week.